Alright guys, so before this video begins, I just wanted to make a quick PSA announcement. Please, and I mean please, for the love of God, lock your doors at night. Whether you're home alone at night or with your family, half of these stories would not have happened if people locked their doors. So take my advice, lock those doors. Now, let's begin. Now, I used to live in a rough part of a dangerous city with my boyfriend. Our apartment wasn't anything special, just a place we could afford while he worked nights. I thought I'd gotten used to the sketchy vibe of the area, but what happened one night still chills me to my core. It started the next evening. My boyfriend was at work, and a friend of ours called me from the front of our building. He sounded rushed and asked me to buzz him in. When I opened the door to let him up, I noticed his face was pale and his hands were shaking. Before I could even ask what was going on, he blurted out, "There was this guy near your car. He was crouched down, and when I walked up, he came at me." My stomach dropped. Our friend explained that he pulled out a weapon, a small knife that he kept for protection, and the guy backed off and bolted. "He dropped something by your car," he added. I glanced out the window, and sure enough, there was a green bundle lying near my car in the dimly lit parking lot. And something about it made my skin crawl. I suggested that we call the police. It felt like overkill at first, but the whole situation was setting off alarms in my head. Within 5 minutes, a single patrol car arrived. The officer asked a few questions, mostly about which direction the guy had went in. But then something unexpected happened. Moments after he radioed in, SWAT, K9 units, and at least 10 other police cars swarmed the area. And it was like a scene from a movie. Officers with rifles, dogs barking, flashlights sweeping the dark corners of the complex. And it turned out, the man wasn't just some random sketchy guy. He had escaped from county jail the night before, along with 2 other inmates. This guy specifically was in for assault with a deadly weapon and multiple domestic violence charges. He had broken into our landlord's camper, which was parked in the yard behind our building, and stayed there overnight after escaping. He'd stolen electronics from the camper, and, more disturbingly, a butcher knife. The police told us he'd likely been trying to break into my car when our friend showed up and startled him. That green bundle, a makeshift bag of stolen items, left behind in his rush to flee. It was horrifying, but the real punch to the gut came when I pieced together what had happened the night before. I had been alone, as usual, because my boyfriend was working. And at one point I'd taken our dog down to the yard behind the building for a bathroom break, the same yard where the camper was parked. I remember noticing something strange. The barbed wire on top of the fence was sagging, like someone had messed with it. My dog had been acting skittish too, whining and staying unusually close to me, but I brushed it off as him reacting to the general vibe of the area. What I didn't know at the time was that the man had been in the camper, watching me the entire time, and I was standing there, completely oblivious, just a few feet away from a dangerous criminal armed with a butcher knife. The thought makes my skin crawl even now. He could have come at me at any moment, and I would have been defenseless. I stayed up the rest of that night, replaying everything in my head. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I'd come to something truly awful. What if my dog hadn't been nervous? What if the guy had decided to act? What if our friend hadn't showed up when he did? We moved out of that apartment as soon as we could. I've never felt so vulnerable in my life. And the worst part is knowing how easily it could have gone unnoticed if things had played out even slightly differently. And it's a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones that happen right in front of you. They're the ones you don't even realize are happening until it's too late. I was about 8 or 9 at the time, living with my mom in a modest apartment complex. She commuted to the city every day for work, leaving me to let myself in after school, lock the door, and entertain myself until she got home. Usually it wasn't a big deal. I'd grab a snack, watch cartoons, or play Neopets until I heard her keys jingling in the lock. One day, though, that routine was shattered in a way that I'll never forget. It started like any other day. I walked home from school, locked the door behind me, and tossed my backpack on the floor. And I was mid-cartoon when there was a sudden, aggressive pounding on the door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was frantic and angry, like someone trying to break in. My heart stopped. "Open the door," a man's voice boomed from the other side, and I froze. I crept up to the door and looked through the peephole. It was one of the older men from the building, probably in his late 40s or early 50s. I had seen him around before, but never spoken to him. His face was twisted in anger, and he was practically leaning his whole body against the door, pounding with one fist while shouting with the other. "You took my wallet," he yelled. "I know you did. Open the door right now." I backed away, my hands trembling. I had no idea what he was talking about. I'd never stolen anything in my life. Panicking, I grabbed the phone and called my mom. She answered quickly, and the moment I heard her voice, I broke down crying. I could barely get the words out between sobs. "There's a man at the door. He's yelling at me, and he won't stop banging." My mom immediately went into protective mode. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone. I'm coming home right now." I could hear her moving, like grabbing her things at work, but she was a full hour and a half away by train. She told me to stay on the line, but the man was still outside, shouting and pounding so loud I couldn't focus on anything she was saying. "Give me my wallet. I know you took it," he screamed, and then slammed the door so hard the frame shook. I was absolutely terrified. My mom hung up for just a moment to call some friends who lived nearby. While I waited, I stayed as far away from the door as I could, crying quietly while the man kept up his tirade. I remember vividly the sound of his heavy breathing between shouts, the way he'd pause for a second, only to start again like a dog with a bone, and eventually he stopped. I heard him mutter something under his breath and then walk away, but when I peeked through the peephole, I saw he left a plastic-wrapped suit, a dry cleaning bag, propped up against the wall. A few minutes later, my mom's friend showed up. By the time they got there, I was too scared to even open the door for them at first. Once they convinced me it was safe, I let them in, and they stayed with me until my mom finally got home. The second she walked in, she did not waste any time. She marched straight to the man's apartment and started pounding on his door, just like he had on ours. When he answered, he looked stunned, like he had not expected any repercussions for what he'd done. "Why the hell do you think it's okay to scare a little girl like that?" she snapped, her voice razor sharp. He said, I thought she took my wallet." "Do you still think she took it?" He hesitated, then admitted, "No, I found it in the car park." The way she looked at him, I swear if looks could kill, he would have dropped dead on the spot. She made him apologize right there, but even then it felt hollow. He muttered a half-hearted sorry, avoiding eye contact before slamming his door shut. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but I never felt safe in that building again. Every time I passed him in the hallway after that, I felt my stomach churn. Even years later, the memory of him screaming through the door still makes my skin crawl. Growing up in a rural area meant you learned to fend for yourself earlier than most kids. My parents owned a small property about 20 minutes outside of town, and while the isolation had its perks, quiet nights, endless space to roam, it also had its dangers. My mom, always the practical one, hated leaving me home alone. She'd constantly tell my dad, "If something happens, you're 20 minutes away from even starting to help." But my dad, he was, let's just say, less responsible. He wasn't malicious or anything, just careless. When I was 7, he had some work meeting in town that he couldn't miss, and for whatever reason, he decided I did not need a babysitter. Before leaving, though, he gave me a crash course in what he probably thought was Rural Survival 101. "All right," he said, crouching down to my level in the kitchen. "If anyone tries to get in here while I'm gone, you grab the shotgun under my bed." I just stared at him, wide-eyed, as he continued. "Here's how you load it," he said, demonstrating with the 12 gauge as if it was no big deal. "Buckshot's already in the box. Slide it in, cock it like this, and if they come through the door, you shoot." I didn't fully understand the gravity of what he was telling me, but he made it sound simple enough. I nodded, trying to absorb every word. Then he left, reminding me to lock the doors behind him. Fast forward a couple of hours, and I was sitting in the living room watching cartoons. The house was eerily quiet, as it always was when I was alone. Every little creak and groan from the old wood floors made my heart race. I didn't touch the phone or try calling anyone, because Dad hadn't said I could, and I didn't want to mess that up. Then the banging started, and at first it was just a single, heavy knock on the front door, and I froze, staring at the screen as if I hadn't heard it. Maybe I imagined it, but then it came again, harder this time. My stomach flipped. My dad's instructions immediately flashed in my head. I ran to his room, my socks sliding on the wood floor, and pulled a shotgun from under the bed. It was heavier than I expected, and my hand shook as I loaded it exactly the way he'd shown me. The cold metal felt wrong in my small hands, but I did not have time to think about that. The banging grew more frantic. Whoever was at the door was desperate to get in. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears as I crept down the hallway, the shotgun awkwardly propped up against my shoulder, my finger hovering over the trigger. I was too scared to speak. My dad hadn't told me to yell or ask who it was. He just said to shoot if they came through, so that's what I was preparing to do. And as I got closer, I could hear the banging stop. For a moment, there was silence. Then a voice, a familiar voice, screamed my name. "Noah." And it was my mom. I froze mid-step. My hands were still trembling as I adjusted the gun. My mom? I wasn't sure. What if someone was tricking me? I'd seen enough movies to know that bad people sometimes pretend to be someone you knew. "Noah, it's me. Open the door," she yelled again, panic clear in her voice. I hesitated, and then I heard her shout something that hit me like a ton of bricks. "Put the gun down. It's me." Somehow she heard me cock the shotgun. I don't even remember making the sound, but she must have heard it from outside. Slowly, I lowered the gun and peeked out the front window. There she was, standing on the porch, her face pale and frantic. I unlocked the door, and the second I opened it, she grabbed me, pulling me into a tight hug. "Oh my God," she said, her voice shaking. "You could have killed me." She was right. If she hadn't yelled, and if I hadn't recognized her voice, I might have pulled the trigger. She told me later she'd forgotten her house key in her rush to get home after finding out Dad left me alone. She'd been so frantic that she hadn't even thought to call out my name right away. When my dad got home that night, my mom unleashed hell on him. I don't remember all the words she said, but they weren't kind. Safe to say, he never left me alone again after that. Even now, as an adult, I can't believe how close I came to shooting my own mom. And I think about it every time I hear someone banging on a door. It's one of those memories that sticks with you forever. When I was in 4th grade, my parents decided I was old enough to walk home from school alone. Looking back as an adult, I can't believe they thought that was a good idea. My house was only about a 10-minute walk from school, and the route was through a quiet neighborhood. But still, it feels insane now. The routine was always the same. I let myself in with my key, lock the door behind me, and wait for my parents to get home around 5. To pass time, I'd grab a Mountain Dew Code Red, a bag of Doritos 3Ds, and zone out to Toonami on Cartoon Network. This day started out just like any other. I got home, locked the door, and set my bag back down in the hallway. I was only about 3 minutes into my usual routine. Hadn't even cracked open the soda yet, when there was a knock at the front door. Normally, I'd just freeze and wait for whoever it was to go away. We never had visitors during the day, and I knew better than to answer. But for some reason, this time I walked up to the door and called out, "Who is it?" A man's voice replied, "Hey, it's your buddy Mike." Immediately my stomach dropped. I did not have a buddy Mike. I didn't even know any adults named Mike. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Goosebumps crawled up my arms. I did not know what to do. "Come on, man," the voice said again, more insistent this time. "Open the door. We gotta go." And then the door handle jiggled. Hard. Like he was testing it, trying to see if it would turn. And I just stood there, frozen. I was maybe a foot away from the door, and I was terrified he'd hear me if I moved. My legs felt like concrete, and my brain was screaming at me to do something. Run, hide, anything. But I couldn't. I was paralyzed. He knocked again, louder this time, and then he jiggled the handle again, even harder. And I thought the lock might snap, and my entire body was shaking. I didn't dare make a sound. And after what felt like forever, everything went quiet. I didn't hear footsteps, but I stayed rooted in place, barely breathing. A minute later, I heard a car door slam, then the sound of an engine starting and fading away as the car drove away. And I didn't move for a long time. When I finally worked up the courage, I peeked out the living room window, but the street was empty. No car, no Buddy Mike, nothing. Just a quiet neighborhood that suddenly felt a lot less safe. The rest of the afternoon was a blur. I sat in the living room with the TV on, but didn't pay attention to anything. Every little noise made me jump. By the time my parents got home, I was still too freaked out to even tell them what had happened. I think I was afraid they'd blame me for answering the door. But the worst part came later, when I realized what this guy had probably done. He must have followed me home. The thought made me sick, and I walked the same route every day, completely oblivious to who might have been watching. And now I was terrified every time I walked to or from school. I kept looking over my shoulder, wondering if someone was there, wondering if it was him. I never saw or heard from Mike again, but that one afternoon changed everything. I stopped feeling safe in my own house. I stopped feeling safe walking around my neighborhood. And to this day, I can't believe my parents thought it was okay to let a fourth grader walk home alone. If you've got kids, do them a favor. Don't make the same mistake. My mom was out of town on vacation with her boyfriend, leaving me and my girlfriend Emily to house sit. It wasn't anything glamorous, just keeping the place clean, watering the plants, and feeding my dog. We lived in a quiet, small-town neighborhood where nothing ever really happened, which probably explains why we let our guard down that night. It was around 12:30 a.m., and we were sitting in the living room binge-watching old sitcoms. The living room was right next to the front porch, separated by two large windows covered with thick curtains. My mom always insisted on keeping those curtains drawn at night, something I never thought much about, until that night. Out of nowhere, we heard heavy footsteps on the porch. They weren't subtle either. These were loud, deliberate steps, like someone wanted us to know they were there. Emily immediately froze, her hand gripping my arm. We both stared at each other, wide-eyed, as the footsteps stopped right in front of the windows. Then, clear as day, we heard a man's voice yell, "Shit, fuck." It wasn't like he stubbed his toe or anything. It sounded more like frustration, like he wasn't expecting something. My gut told me it was because the curtains were closed, and if they hadn't been, he would have seen us sitting there, just a few feet away. Panic set in immediately. I motioned for Emily to stay quiet, while I reached over to turn off the lamp next to the couch. The room went pitch dark, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps started again, this time moving away from the porch. And as soon as they faded, I crept up to the window and carefully pulled the curtain back just an inch to look outside. There he was, a big, burly man, pacing on the sidewalk in front of the house. He was holding a plastic bag in one hand, though I couldn't tell what was in it. Here's the thing, we lived in the middle of nowhere. By that time of night, every store, gas station, or fast food joint was closed. So where he got that bag, or what was inside, was a mystery. Emily whispered, "What's he doing?" And I just shook my head. The guy walked down the street a bit, but then he stopped, turned around, and started walking back toward the house. My stomach dropped. Instead of coming back to the porch, though, he veered off into the parking lot of an old church next door. The lot was dark and overgrown with weeds, and he disappeared into the shadows. "Maybe he's gone," Emily said, but before I could answer, we heard the unmistakable sound of the side door's doorknob jiggling. My dog, a tiny terrier with a bark bigger than his bite, went ballistic. He rushed to the door, barking and growling like he was ready to take on a grizzly bear. The jiggling stopped almost immediately. We sat there frozen, listening for what felt like an eternity. Finally, we heard footsteps retreating, growing fainter until they were gone. We stayed up for another hour, barely saying a word, just waiting to see if he'd come back. He didn't. We debated calling the cops, but what would we even say? A guy walked on our porch and tried the door. It felt so anticlimactic, despite how terrifying it had been in the moment. We decided not to bother, and eventually fell asleep, though I didn't sleep much at all that night. The next morning, I checked the side door. Sure enough, there were smudges on the doorknob, like someone had been messing with it. I also noticed faint footprints on the porch. Dirt and grime tracked over the clean boards my mom had just swept before she left. Nothing ever came of it. We didn't see the guy again, and no one in the neighborhood reported anything strange. To this day, I can't help but wonder what his plan was, or what was in that plastic bag. Whatever it was, I'm just glad my mom's curtains were closed that night. Last fall, my girlfriend and I were both traveling a lot for work. It wasn't unusual for one of us to be home alone for a few days. She was in San Francisco, and I was alone in our apartment for a couple of nights. We live on the top floor of a building, and there's a shared rooftop deck above us that anyone in the building can access. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. and decided to use the bathroom. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, just a typical middle-of-the-night grogginess. When I walked back to the bedroom, I glanced toward the study. There's a sliding glass door in there that leads to a small balcony. And then I froze. I saw the outline of a person standing on my balcony, facing me. I stood still for a second, trying to make sense of it. My brain was foggy, and I thought maybe I was just seeing things, but it was too clear. There was someone out there. I couldn't tell who they were, but they were definitely looking straight at me. I felt my heart start to race. I bolted into the kitchen, grabbed the first knife I could find, and pulled my phone from my pocket to dial 911. As I was hitting the emergency number, I looked back towards the study, where the lights were still off, and saw the person react. They immediately grabbed the railing of the balcony and flung themselves over it. I was in a complete panic. I ran to the sliding door, threw it open, and looked down to the balcony below me, expecting to see a body on the ground or, worse, someone still in midair. But there was nothing, No blood, no crash. I looked back at the balcony below, and then I saw him. The same kid, no more than 16, maybe 17, was standing there like nothing had happened. He did not look injured at all. And then he jumped again. He climbed over the railing of that balcony and jumped down to the next one, landing on the third floor deck. From there, he jumped again, landing on the parking lot behind the building. I watched him sprint off into the dark alley behind our place, without a single mark on him. My hands were still shaking when I hung up with 911. The dispatcher said they'd send someone, but honestly, I thought it was all some messed up prank. When the cops finally arrived, they went to the roof and broke up some party. Turns out the kid was just a drunk friend of someone on the second floor. Apparently, he'd been dared to jump from one balcony to the next. He was fine, not a scratch on him. They said the guy had no idea how lucky he was. I was in disbelief, but that wasn't even the worst part. As if this wasn't weird enough, my dog was asleep in the living room the entire time, about 15 feet from the balcony. Not a single bark, nothing. He didn't even flinch. I don't know if that's more terrifying than the kid or what. And to this day, I don't really know what to think about it. A kid jumping from balcony to balcony at 3 a.m. I'd say it was just a bizarre prank if it didn't feel so real. But then again, maybe the weirdest part is that my dog did not react at all. I'm just glad no one got hurt. And I was 15, maybe 16 when this happened. It was a Friday night, and my parents were out having dinner with some friends. They'd be gone for about 3 hours, and I was supposed to stay home alone. Nothing unusual. I'd done it 100 times before, but this time was different. This time, I genuinely thought I might die. It started around 8 p.m. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone with the TV on in the background. Everything was normal until I heard a loud bang from the garage. At first I thought it might have been the wind or something falling over, but then I heard it again, louder this time, and I froze, trying to listen. That's when I heard someone shouting, "Where is he?" over and over, followed by another loud crash. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just a random noise. Someone was out there. My first instinct was to stay completely still. I muted the TV, but my hands were shaking so badly that I accidentally dropped the remote. It hit the floor with a loud thud, and I winced. The shouting stopped for a second. Then the guy yelled, "I know you're in there, Frank." That's my dad's name. I crept to the front window and peeked out. I couldn't see much, but I could hear him pounding on the garage door now, swearing and yelling. My heart was racing so hard it felt like my chest was going to explode. Then there was a deafening smash. I realized he'd broken one of the windows on the garage door. I grabbed my phone and dialed my mom. Looking back, I should have called the police first, but I wasn't thinking clearly. My mom picked up on the second ring. I whispered, "Mom, someone's in the garage. He's yelling for Dad. He's breaking stuff." I was trying so hard not to cry, but my voice cracked. She must have heard the panic because she did not ask questions. She just said, "Lock yourself somewhere safe. We're coming. I'm calling the police." And as soon as I hung up, there was another crash. This time, the side door to the garage. He'd kicked it in. I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bathroom, phone still in hand. I could hear him yelling, louder now. He sounded furious. "You think you can mess with my family, Frank?" he screamed, followed by the sound of something smashing against the garage wall. It sounded like a bat or a pipe. He moved from the garage to the driveway, and that's when I heard the glass shattering again. I peeked out of the bathroom window and saw him smashing the windshield of my mom's car with what looked like a metal pipe. He wasn't just angry, he was completely unhinged, and I thought for sure he'd come into the house next. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped my phone again. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to make a noise or move. I just sat there, huddled in the corner, trying to stay as quiet as possible. About 5 minutes later, though it felt like hours, I heard sirens. The guy didn't even try to run. When the cops showed up, he just stood there in the driveway, shouting about my dad. I watched from the window as they tackled him to the ground. When my parents got home, my mom ran straight to me and hugged me like her life depended on it. My dad was pale and I could tell he was shaken up too. Turns out, the guy was married to one of my dad's co-workers. She'd been cheating on him with another man, but when her husband found out, she panicked and told him the other guy was my dad to throw him off the trail. The police arrested him for trespassing, vandalism, and who knows what else. My dad's co-worker confessed everything after the fact, and apparently, the guy believed her until that night. He thought he was coming to confront the man who ruined his marriage. We pressed charges, but I never really felt safe in that house again. Every little noise would send me into a panic for months. I don't think I'll ever forget the sound of his voice, or the way the glass shattered. And I still wonder what would have happened if he actually made it inside. We used to live in a pretty dodgy neighborhood. One of those places where you'd hear about break-ins or sketchy incidents every other week. My sister and I were renting this tiny, run-down house that we could barely afford. It wasn't much, but it was home. One morning I had to head out early to run a couple of errands. My sister, who has never been a morning person, was still asleep when I left. I did not think much about it at the time, but I forgot to lock the door behind me. It wasn't like this was the first time it had happened, but it was stupid, especially considering where we lived. I was gone for maybe an hour tops. When I got back, everything seemed normal. My sister was up, making coffee, scrolling through her phone like usual. I didn't think anything of it. We hung out for a bit, and then, maybe a half an hour later, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, 2 cops were standing there. Not the friendly neighborhood kind either. They looked serious. They asked to speak with my sister. I did not know what this was about, but I called her over. She seemed confused at first, but she talked to them for like 5 minutes. I couldn't hear much because they kept their voices low, but I could tell from her face that whatever they were saying was unsettling. After they left, I talked to her. "What the hell was that about?" I asked her. She looked shaken, but tried to play it off like it wasn't a big deal. Apparently some guys have been going around banging on doors and attacking people when they answer, she said, shrugging like she was trying to convince herself that it wasn't a big deal. That's when she told me what happened while I was gone. She'd woken up to loud banging on the front door. Not a polite knock either, but someone slamming their fists or shoulder into it. Half asleep, she thought it was me, that maybe I locked myself out. She wasn't in any rush to answer it because she assumed I just forgot my keys again. By the time she finally shuffled over to open the door, the banging had stopped. When she opened it, there was no one there. She thought it was weird, but not weird enough to care. She just shut the door and went about her day. Hearing this, I immediately felt my stomach drop. "And you didn't think to call me or, I don't know, lock the door after?" She rolled her eyes at me. I did not know it was anything serious. I started putting the pieces together and felt a chill crawl up my spine. The cops weren't just talking about some random guy. This was our house. That guy had been at our door. Later that day, we checked the news and found out more about the guy they were after. Apparently, he'd been hitting houses all over the area. His MO was brutal. He'd knock hard on the door, pretending to be in trouble or desperate. When someone answered, he'd lunge at them with a knife, overpower them, and force his way inside to rob the place. From what the police told my sister, he had definitely been at our door that morning. For some reason, though, he didn't stick around long enough for her to open it. Maybe he got spooked when she took too long. Maybe he thought no one was home and bailed. Whatever the reason, it probably saved her life. The guy was caught later that day, just a few streets over, still carrying the knife. One of his victims wasn't so lucky. She ended up in the hospital with serious injuries. The whole thing freaked us out, but it also pissed me off. Not because I did not lock the door. My sister could have been in real danger. And after that, we both got a lot more careful. For months, we double-checked the locks every single time we left the house, even if we were just stepping out for a second. We moved out of that neighborhood about a year later, and I still think about that morning sometimes. And it's scary how close something like that can come to happening. If she'd opened the door just a little faster, I don't even want to think about it. Anyway, let this be a reminder. Always lock your damn doors. You never know who's out there. Growing up, my parents were pretty relaxed. We lived in what most people would call a safe neighborhood. The kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids played outside until the streetlights came on. I was about 7 or 8, and my sister was 11. That summer, my parents let us set up a tent in the backyard. It was a thrill for us, like camping, but without the scary parts of being out in the woods. Most nights, it was fine. We'd stay up whispering and laughing until we eventually fell asleep. But one night changed everything. It started like any other. My sister and I had climbed into our sleeping bags and spent an hour or so telling dumb jokes before dozing off. I don't know how long I was asleep before the noise woke me up. A deep, chopping sound that seemed to shake the air around us. A helicopter, and I sat up groggily, confused. My sister was already awake, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the tent. Then we heard the sirens, close. They wailed and echoed through the neighborhood. My stomach clenched. "What's going on?" I whispered. "I don't know," my sister said, her voice shaking. "Let's go inside." We didn't hesitate. Grabbing a flashlight, we unzipped the tent and bolted back for the door. Our bare feet slapped against the cool grass. The sirens were louder now, and I swear I could feel the thud of the helicopter blades in my chest. My hand shook as I fumbled with the lock on the sliding door. My sister shoved me aside and got it open. The second we were inside, we locked it. I don't know why I thought to do it. At that age, I wasn't always the most cautious kid, but something about the chaos outside made me feel like we needed to do it. My sister leaned against the door, catching her breath. That's when we saw him. A man, dressed in black, climbed over our fence and landed in the yard. He moved fast, like he was in a panic, and his face was wild. He ran up to the glass door and started pounding on it with both fists. "Open the door," he screamed. "Let me in." I froze. My sister grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. Neither of us said anything. We just stood there, staring at him. He kept yelling, his voice frantic and raw. He hit the glass so hard I thought he might break it. "Please, just open the door." I didn't move. My sister did not move. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a few minutes, he stopped. He looked over his shoulder, then back at us, his eyes wide. I could hear the sirens getting louder. Then he turned and ran. We did not sleep that night. Even after the sirens faded and the helicopter moved on, we stayed up, huddled together on the couch. At some point, my parents came downstairs to check on us. By then, the man was long gone. When we told them what had happened, they looked shocked but relieved. The next day, we learned the full story. Our next-door neighbors told us that the man had been robbing houses in the area for weeks. That night, he'd broken into their house while they were out. The police had been chasing him through the neighborhood when he decided to hide in our yard. The crazy part, the only reason they caught him was because he wasted so much time trying to get us to open the door. The police surrounded him in the yard next to ours, and I still think about that night. For years, I had nightmares about him breaking through the glass or finding another way inside. But in a weird way, I'm thankful for how it turned out. If I hadn't locked that door, who knows what could have happened. Looking back, I realized my childhood anxiety probably saved us that night. My sister and I never slept in the backyard again. Some lessons you don't need to learn twice. It happened about a year ago when my husband and I had just moved into our first house. The area wasn't great, but it was all we could afford at the time. My husband worked nights, so it was usually just me and the dogs at home after dark. I didn't mind it too much. Our 2 German shepherds, Luna and Scout, were great company, and they made me feel a little safer. But at the time, we did not own any firearms, which I regretted later. This particular night, there was a nasty storm. It was 2, maybe 3 in the morning, and the wind was howling outside. The rain lashed against the windows, and the thunder shook the walls. The dogs and I were curled up in bed, trying to ignore the noise. Scout was already snoring at my feet, and Luna was pressed up against me, her ears occasionally twitching at the thunder. Then I heard it, the faint jingling of bells we'd hung up on the back door. They were meant to help the dogs signal when they needed to go outside, but this wasn't one of them nudging the door. It was deliberate, like the door had been pushed open. My stomach dropped. At first I told myself it was just the storm. Maybe the wind had blown the door open. And I slid out of bed, whispering to Luna to follow me. Scout stayed asleep. Typical. The hallway was dark, but I could see the faint glow of the kitchen light we always left on. As I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. The back door was wide open, rain pouring in, and standing in the doorway was a man. He wasn't wearing a mask or anything. He was just staring at me. He looked rough, unkempt beard, soaked hoodie, hands shoved in his pockets like he was deciding what to do next. For a second, neither of us moved. I felt paralyzed. Then he stepped inside, and I screamed, "Luna, get him," hoping to startle him more than anything. To my shock, Luna launched herself over the banister. I'd never seen her move like that before. She hit the guy full force, snarling and snapping. He stumbled backward, cursing, and slammed into the door frame. I ran down the stairs, screaming as loud as I could to make it clear that I wasn't alone. The guy scrambled to his feet and bolted out the back door, leaving it swinging in the wind. Luna chased him a few feet into the yard before running back to me, her fur bristling and her teeth bared. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and dragged the kitchen table in front of it for good measure. Then I called the police. They showed up about 20 minutes later, but by then the guy was long gone. The officer told me I did the right thing, but they did not find any footprints in the mud outside. We ended up getting a gun after that, and I don't sleep without it within arm's reach. Luna still sleeps next to me every night, and I'll never doubt her instincts again. If she hadn't been there, I do not want to think about what might have happened. Hey, what's up guys? It's Spooky. If you've made it this far, congratulations, you survived. If you did not know, I have an Instagram. Follow me on there so we can connect. And I also have a Patreon. On there you'll have direct access to me and can see the upcoming videos, polls, and soon-to-be exclusive stories only shared on there. If that's something that interests you, please consider joining. That's all I have for you guys tonight. Stay spooky, and I'll see you in the next video.